Welcome to lecture number 9, Hardware and Software Controls. So typical agenda that we'll follow today, we'll first go over the last lecture and chapter in review. Then we'll summarize what the lecture and chapter objectives are for this particular lecture. We'll get into the lecture itself and we'll summarize with some review questions. So last lecture what we started to get into was different types of controls. So we talked about the information security model in previous chapters. We talked about the definition of information security is and what the CIA triad is and how systems administrators typically perform many of the tasks that are associated with information security, at least traditionally. And then we started to get into what are the different types of threats, the vulnerabilities, assets, and so on and so forth, as well as asset categorization, vulnerabilities, different types of threats that may affect those vulnerabilities, and so on. Now we're really getting into deep now into controls. What are the different mechanisms that people can employ to help prevent cyber attack from happening? And last class we talked about identity management, so going ahead and managing the different identities within an organization, being able to identify who the people are, being able to consolidate them accordingly, consolidate their records, managing them accordingly, and that type of thing. We talked about access management. Once you have that consolidated, reconciled list of users or identities within your organization, being able to perform access management, identifying exactly what resources those people will be able to get access to. We talked about authentication, the manner in which you could be authenticated, which is something you know, something you are, something that you have. Talked about biometrics as being something that you are, passwords something that you know, and something, and then something that you have is say something like tokens or so on. Talked about single sign-on. Single sign-on is something that we use on a day-to-day basis, where it's you log into MyUSF and you have access to your payroll, you have access to your Canvas and many other aspects of systems across the university. Then we talked about federation, being able to federate the access between organizations. Say that there's a person that is working at a university and a startup. If the person wants to get access to a startup, the startup can resources, the startup can go ahead and verify with the university that they are still a university employee, and so on. So in this lecture, we're going to continue with controls, and we're going to summarize and define the following. We're going to start to get into password management. So last lecture we talked about passwords and the different types of passwords that could exist, you know, the complexity of them and that type of thing. We're also going to talk about access control lists, so user access and so on, firewalls and their capabilities, intrusion detection and prevention systems, patching operating systems and applications, and endpoint protection. Now, a couple of key things that I want to summarize about these different aspects which we'll be talking about today. These are really critical concepts within the InfoSec realm. If you go to a major cybersecurity conference such as Black Hat or DEF CON or those RSA and so on, they're going to be talking a lot about firewalls and intrusion detection systems and prevention systems and so on. Moreover, a lot of the major cybersecurity vendors that exist today, many of the major cybersecurity companies that exist today are delivering products that may be enhanced firewalls or enhanced intrusion detection systems or methods to patch operating systems in their applications and so on. So these are really fundamental concepts into a lot of the different technologies that you'll see within organizations that are trying to bolster their cybersecurity posture. So let's go ahead and remember, we go ahead and review this every class, but remember that there's the IT system. The IT system has information assets within it, but oftentimes those IT systems will have some form of a vulnerability that's susceptible to a particular type of threat. Now, the controls are in place so that you can prevent those threats from penetrating against those IT systems accordingly. And controls are safeguards that are used to minimize the impact of threats. So there are mechanisms that you put into place that help stymie the possibility of a threat. And the reason for this is that vulnerabilities and threats in and against our assets are not going to be going away. So a systems administrator's response is to employ controls accordingly. And simple controls can be very effective. So that circular ring around the IT system could represent passwords, firewalls, so on and so forth. And the information security's goal is to deploy the appropriate controls. Remember that there's different types of controls as well. There's physical controls, procedural controls, technical controls, and so on and so forth. Now, the key thing here is that within large organizations, procedures are very important, and also controls are very fuzzy categories. Most controls fall under multiple categories. So for example, passwords could be considered as a technical control, a procedural control, or a physical control. It just depends on how you define it and how you view it within your organization. So the best known controls are used in almost every computer, and it's not a comprehensive list of controls. In your career, there are going to be many different controls that you may employ within your organization. So there could be application-specific controls and so on. And the goal is to introduce the basics of underlying information security controls so you can evaluate the merits of other controls. So you want to be able to identify what are the different types of information security controls that you have at your disposal and see how they fit within your organization, see how they are relevant to your business processes, and how they can be employed in an effective and efficient manner. And moreover, not just employing a single control, but employing multiple controls stacked on top of each other and so on. So in this lecture, we're going to be talking about 6 different types of controls: password management, access control lists, firewalls and their capabilities, intrusion detection and prevention systems, patching operating systems and their applications, and endpoint protection. So passwords, the definitions that you want to know about passwords is that identification is a presentation of a user identity for the system. So it's typically done by a username. So that's how you identify yourself to a system. The authentication is establishing the confidence in the validity of a claimed identity, and it's typically done by using a password. So the password authenticates you to getting access to a particular asset within an organization. And ideally, this password will be a secret series of characters that's known only to the owner. The design goals of the passwords, like we talked about in previous classes, is that it should be simple enough for average users, but secure enough for most applications. So you want to make sure that the application that's using that password has some form of complexity associated with that. It's secure enough for that, but it's simple enough for the average user to be able to remember it and not use the same password across multiple accounts, across multiple systems. So there are different types of passwords that exist. First one that's very, very simple is a personal identification number, or PIN. It's a short 4 to 6-digit numerical password, and it's very useful for when small keypads are necessary. So for example, ATM machines and so on. So regular passwords could potentially create human safety problems. So for example, airport fire suppression systems. It's very difficult to be inputting a 12-digit multi-character, multi-numeric password into a fire suppression system when you need that fire suppression system to go off immediately. So you want to have a PIN that's going to be very easy to input into that particular fire suppression system. Now the drawback with PINs is that they're relatively insecure. They're short and they can be easily guessed, and they only provide some sort of limited security. And what PINs also assume is that there's some other form of security measures that are available. So in this case, for example, at an ATM, there's daily withdrawal limits and security cameras at the ATMs. Those are additional mechanisms that are provided that will help make sure that the security of the asset is being maintained. And in airports, you can think about the physical security that's there. We talked about, the physical controls, having a lock there or something like that. And that type of mechanism that will help ensure the CIA, or the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of that particular asset. If you can also think about your debit card, or you have a lot of cards have gone over to the chip and pin system, where there's a chip, right? That's something that you have, and then the pin is something that you know. So it's multiple forms of security that are helping protect that particular asset, which in that case would be your financial resources. So the other types of password types that exist are passphrases. A passphrase is something that we're very used to. It's a sequence of words that serves as a password. So for example, wow, this class is #1 class at school. So I'm sure you're all thinking that this is the #1 class at school. At least I hope that you're thinking that. That would be really, really fantastic. But the motivation for this is that the human brain can retain up to 7 chunks of information in short-term memory, but each chunk can be fairly large. So passphrases can actually be longer than passwords. So simple passphrases can actually be quite effective, but long passphrases are not necessarily safer. The reason for that is because they can be easily predictable and easily guessed. So if you have a password that's TIT, this class is the number one class at school that's measured in this way, that's not as easily predictable as, say, this one right here, as this password up here. So far, you have pretty much in your life, you've been a user of passwords, but in the profession, in the systems administrator's profession, in that particular position, you are on the other side. You're making it all work. In particular, information security of passwords is in your custody. You'll have systems that are maintaining all of these passwords. You want a mechanism that is going to help you maintain and manage those particular passwords. So what you want to think about is the process of defining, implementing, and maintaining password policies throughout an enterprise. How do you have people adhere to a particular password privacy, of how long password should be, how do you implement that, and how do you maintain that? And doing so will help reduce the likelihood that systems using passwords will be compromised. And there's actually a publication that's out there by NIST, 800-118. That's the Guide to Enterprise Password Management. If you Google this, you'll be able to see exactly this publication. So the information security concerns that are associated with password management is that the CIA triad is reintroduced. Organizations need to protect the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of passwords. So the asset management terminology is that passwords are restricted and essential information assets. So remember, we talked about the restricted and essential information assets are in the asset management lecture. So the loss of confidentiality or integrity can give intruders improper access to information. So hence, passwords are restricted assets. And the non-availability of a password can make the underlying protected resource unavailable. So passwords are essential. That's kind of the logic behind that. A quick story, I think I mentioned in previous lectures that I took a Black Hat penetration testing course in 2015. And what the Black Hat pen testers were talking about in that particular course is that they don't even care about dropping malware in systems anymore, because the antiviruses, some of them are so sophisticated that they'll actually pick up those malicious binaries and block them accordingly. In fact, they'll rather go the password route and try to identify passwords that will actually enable them to get access into systems. The reason for this is that you're not flagging or triggering any antivirus or any type of endpoint security, which we'll get to a little bit later on in the lecture. You're not triggering any of that if you're employing just a username and password credential. So if we think back to the last lecture, a lot of passwords are dumped online. If I were to write a script that would just test those usernames and passwords across multiple systems, I could probably get access into those systems, because basic human psychology is say, hey, I'm going to use the same password across multiple systems and so on. So NIST, for those of you that don't know, is the National Institute for Standards and Technology. It's the guidelines for minimum recommendations regarding password management. It's the basis for the discussion that we're having here. Specific organizations may have more stringent password management requirements. So for example, banks and hospitals may impose additional requirements, and this includes requiring mechanisms other than passwords for authentication. So again, something that you have or something that you are. For optimal or minimal investment, what you want to make sure is that you begin with the recognition of threats that could compromise the passwords, and take actions to minimize the likelihood of these compromises. Now what NIST has done is that they've recognized that there are 4 common threats to passwords: password capturing, password guessing and cracking, password replacing, and using compromised passwords. Password capturing is the ability of an attacker to acquire a password from storage, transmission, or user knowledge and behavior. So it's actually being able to capture the particular passwords that are being that are being used. Now, one mechanism that you could think about is, there's the improper storage of passwords, not making sure that it's hashed or encrypted or any way, the unencrypted transmission and so on. But if you think back to one of the past assignments where I asked you to look at the SCADA paper, one of my SCADA papers, what you notice is that there was a lot of default usernames and passwords that were available. Now what you can do is that you can actually capture that default username and password by just looking at the manual of that particular SCADA system, and typically they'll have the username and password, the default username and password available there. There's also password guessing, where we talked about brute forcing in the previous lecture. So password guessing is an intruder makes multiple repeated attempts to authenticate using possible passwords such as default passwords and dictionary words. So it's just guessing what the passwords are and putting it out there. So there are databases out there for a lot of information security professionals that are the most commonly used passwords, and a lot of them are very simple. You'd actually be quite shocked to see how simple some of these passwords actually are. You can Google it and you'll see that some of these passwords are just like hello, and it's very, very simple. Password cracking is a process of generating a character string that matches any existing password string on the targeted system, and it requires unrestricted access to the unencrypted or the encrypted versions of saved passwords. So with password cracking, you're just going ahead and generating character strings that will actually be used to help crack or break into that system using that particular generated password. Password replacing is substituting the user's existing password with a password known to the attacker. And this typically happens with various social engineering techniques, and it's exploiting weaknesses in the system's password reset policies. So what this means is that if you have access to that particular person's email account, for example, what you can do is that you could just reset the password for one of their accounts, and they'll send an email to that particular system will send an email to the email account and say, hey, you can go ahead and reset your passwords this way, and then you can, what will happen is that the password will just be replaced. This can also happen after a password has already been breached. So the attacker knows what the password is, and they get into the system, and then they change the password so that the person can't actually get into the system that they need to get access to. Using compromised passwords is that passwords on a system is known to unauthorized users, and it may be used to exploit or may be exploited to launch other social engineering attacks, change file permissions on sensitive files. So basically affect the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of the particular information assets that are on that IT system. So password management recommendations, what do you exactly do if you are a systems administrator or an information security professional within your organization? You want to set the rules for using passwords. For users, what kinds of passwords are allowed? What are the lengths and complexity for passwords? And for administrators, how can passwords be stored, transmitted, issued to new users, and reset as necessary? So account for any industry-specific regulations. So if you're, say, the USF bookstore or the University of Arizona bookstore, you have to be payment card industry compliant, so the PCI compliant. You have to make sure that your password management adheres to any sort of compliance that is associated with your particular organization, or more importantly, your industry. Because if you don't, then you could get dinged for that. Moving on with password management, dealing with password guessing and cracking, how do you go against doing that? You want to pay attention to the password storage. So access to files and databases used to store passwords should be tightly restricted. So very few people should know about where the passwords are being stored, and more importantly, it should be tightly restricted. One of the mechanisms that you can do this is that you can save password hashes, not the passwords themselves. And what the idea is like what we talked about in previous lectures with encryption, is that you can actually have the password be hashed, and you store the hash itself, but not the password. So when the attacker gets into your system and they get access to a hash, they won't necessarily know on how to decrypt that. And we've seen the different types of hashing mechanisms that exist. We talked about RSA and the bitwise and so on and so forth, and the cyclic redundancy check and so on. So those are all different mechanisms that you could use to hash your passwords so that they're more protected within a database and so on. If you do feel the need to exchange passwords, then what will happen is that you should encrypt all of the password exchange. So there should be a mechanism that's there that will encrypt those passwords such that people won't be able to use them accordingly. And please, 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 please do not email your passwords back and forth with each other. You want to strictly verify the identity of all users who attempt to recover forgotten passwords or reset passwords. And this is where something like identity management comes so critically into play, where if you don't know the identities within your organization, and that's why we're going through that exercise in the assignment, then you will have a difficult time identifying who gets access to what, or more importantly, who are the people that are actually using these usernames and passwords. And you can educate all users of password stealing attempts through phishing attacks, shoulder surfing, and other methods. And this is something that you'll have to verify with your team and within your organization, so that you launch an actual phishing attack against your own employees to see how many people actually click on that link. And you hold a seminar, or you hold a talk, or you even send an email about, hey, we tested this out. We noticed that many of you are actually clicking on these links. That could actually provide a very good mechanism for people to be able to, hey, I engaged in this behavior in the past. I'll be more careful with it in the future. With regards to the complexity, the passwords must be made sufficiently complex, and the accounts must be locked after many successive failed login attempts. This minimizes the opportunities for a hacker to guess the password or try to brute force a password. Additionally, you can do what's called password expiration, so the duration for which passwords can be used without change. And this reduces the likelihood that a compromised password can be used productively. Oftentimes, password collection and password usage are separate occasions. So this creates a delay before the compromised password is used. And the password compromise may not be very damaging, because the password has been changed before before the attacker actually gets to use it. Now, the issue with doing something like this, and this is something that you'll need to know as an information security professional, is that in the absence of password synchronization, or SSO, users may forget passwords, so it may be very costly for IT to recover forgotten passwords. So you want to use this very judiciously and ensure the longest possible durations. A mechanism that you could consider having is making sure that the passwords, depending on their complexity, the more complex the password is, the longer the user can actually use that particular password. So this enforces the password complexity component with the users as well. So some of the limitations with passwords, although passwords are very powerful, very useful, and very simple in a lot of ways, there are some limitations to them, and there are alternatives to them as well. Users, in terms of limitations, users often forget passwords. So help desks have to respond to user requests. This is very expensive. A mechanism for this is that there's password reset mechanisms where the challenge questions may not be strong enough. They're relatively simple social engineering attacks, such as phishing, that can exploit reset mechanisms and so on. So it's considerable interest in developing alternatives, but it's not an easy task. It's a non-trivial task because users know how to use passwords. And there's limited data available on actual losses suffered by organizations due to password theft. Why fix what's not broken? But some of the proposals for alternatives is pass faces, where a user selects a predefined set of human faces, and the user selects a face from this set among those that are presented during a login attempt, and then draw a secret. Users draw a continuous line across a grid of squares, and many of you have seen this on Android phones. So that's really what in terms of password management. That's one of the key things that systems administrators have to deal with, because passwords are just so prevalent within an organization that it's important to make sure that you have the appropriate mechanisms in place, that you can manage the passwords and set the password lengths accordingly, and so on and so forth. With regards to access control lists, access control is limiting access to information system resources only to authorized users, programs, processes, and other systems. So for example, you can think about this as locks. Access control models are descriptions of the availability of resources in a system. So the representation of access control and computer security. And properties of access control models is that they represent the protection needs of any resource at varying levels of granularity. And this is without unreasonable computational burden on an operating system. Some of the popular access control models are access control lists and role-based access control. Access control lists list of permissions that are attached to specific objects. So use simple syntax to specify. So for example, subjects, objects, and allowed operations. So who are the subjects? Who are the identities? What are the objects? So for example, the subject here is the host, which is this particular IP address. This could be your particular computer. The object is any resource on the network. This could be printers, this could be scanners, this could be other mobile devices, and so on. And the operation is blocked from passing through the network connection. So you're limiting what this person can do based on the specific types of assets that are on the network and so on. And operating system checks all incoming resource requests. So any ACL entry may prohibit access to the resource. The common use for access control lists is for files and network connections. So you can specify the rights for users or groups to certain files or executables. Say, for example, there's confidential files within an organization that you can only get access to after you sign a non-disclosure agreement or an NDA. And what you can do here is that you can actually specify to the access control list and be like, hey, I don't want this group to have access to this particular resource. And in fact, many of you actually already did that with the chmod command in the systems administration chapter. Regarding network connections, you can specify the port numbers and network addresses that may be accessed. It's a common way to implement firewalls. Some default ACLs are present in most modern operating systems. They provide reasonable levels of security for the average user. Some of the properties is that they're some of the simplest controls to implement, and they're the basis for many other security controls. So prevent overriding of passwords and so on. So with passwords and access control lists, those are actually two very powerful yet very simplistic mechanisms that you can use in order to make sure that your organization is very safe and secure. Because a lot of the attacks will actually occur from poor password management or improperly configured access control lists. So let's talk a little bit more about access control lists right here. So this is a simple representation of access control lists. There's subjects that attempt operations on objects, and the operations are permitted if allowed by the ACL. So we can see here is that we have John, Bob, and Alice. What they can do with the host right here is that these are the different types of objects, and these are the operations that are allowed. So for the host, which is a particular machine, for example, this will actually be blocked for John and blocked for Bob, but Alice will have access to it. For file 1, John has the ability to own, read, and write, but Bob only has the ability to read, and Alice has the ability to execute. Whereas for file 2, John has the ability to read, Bob has the ability to read, and Alice has the ability to own, read, write, and execute. And where this becomes useful is that you're able to specify exactly who gets access to what. And the important part here is that you have to know your business processes accordingly, such that you're able to define these particular roles and these particular limitations for people on your network. And you can group people by different departments and different groupings, and new members of your organization and so on. Now the limitations with ACLs, although they're very powerful, is that they have limited scalability. If you want to modify permissions for a specific user and try to scale that to a large scale, it's going to be very difficult. So permission for that user must be modified individually on all access to which the user has access. And you can imagine that this particular process would get very, very cumbersome and tedious for a very large organization. And it's not possible to assign permissions based off of user responsibilities. What happens when a user changes roles? The role appropriate permissions for the user must be modified individually on all applicable objects. So something like role-based access control comes into play to help with these limitations. What you want to think about is that they assign permissions to user roles rather than individual users. So roles are created for job functions. So at the high level, what a systems administrator will do is that based on the business processes within an organization, they will be able to identify what are the different roles that are critical for that organization. From there, they can define a set of permissions or responsibilities that are associated with that particular role. And the access permissions are defined for those roles. The separation between users and access control. So users will evolve within an organization, but the role can be assigned. So if there's a low-level role for a new person within an organization, as they progress through the organization, they may get to higher level roles, which may give them additional access to more resources on your network and overall in your organization. So an RBAC, a role-based access control system, will actually reduce the cost and administrative effort compared to ACLs. So password management and ACLs, those are two very powerful components that actually can help improve the cybersecurity posture significantly within your organization. And both of those look more at the people level, the people and business level within an organization. So the key phrase here is that within the organization. Firewalls is hardware or software that prevent the dangers originating on one network from spreading to another network. So you can think about this as that the firewall is actually protecting an organization. It's creating a bubble around an organization such that if there's a threat that comes in from the external, then what will happen is that the firewall will be able to prevent that accordingly. It allows one network to connect to another network while maintaining some amount of protection. So a door to a home or office allows residents to get in or out of the house. It blocks the rain and sleet from entering the home and maintains some degree of confidentiality. So just think about your home or your apartment and so on. Those particular doors will allow you to get in or out, and it will block the rain or sleet from entering your home, and that will ruin the assets within your home. It also allows you to maintain some degree of confidentiality. And firewalls serve multiple purposes. It restricts entry and exit from the network to carefully specified locations. It limits incoming internet traffic to specific applications running on specific devices. And it blocks outgoing traffic from hosts suspected to have been compromised. So say, for example, something did get through to one of your devices on your network. What the firewall will help you do as well is it'll help you protect, again, help that particular machine protect against attacking other machines out in the real world. So some of the constraints with firewalls is that they're not generally intended to defend against specialized attacks. So the doors of a retail store are not designed to detect shoppers with explosive or shoplifters. But so one of the benefits is that they're very effective and relatively inexpensive first line of a defense. They defend against a large number of common nuisances. So as an organization, let's just take FireEye for example. FireEye is a major organization that actually has what are called sensor networks deployed across the world, where they will have sensors that are picking up all the different types of network traffic that are flowing in and across multiple networks across the world. Now what they'll see is that they could often see millions of attacks per day because people out there, some of the hackers out there, just constantly have things scanning. And so firewalls are very effective and a very relatively inexpensive first line of defense, and they'll defend against these large amounts of attacks that are out there because there's multiple organizations or multiple people out there that are actually trying to conduct these malicious attacks, but they're just doing it at a large scale. It's a very mass form of attack. So you can think about the mass malware we talked about in previous lectures. It's just a way of going ahead and attacking multiple organizations, but what firewalls will do is they'll help actually prevent those basic types of attacks from entering in. So you can think about a firewall arrangement as follows. So the figure shows a typical arrangement. There's the internet out here, and here's your local network that has all of your particular assets on it, or a select set of assets. The firewall will actually intercept all the traffic between the internet and the organization network. Now the key thing here with the firewall is that it'll implement the organization's traffic rules. So what I mean by this is that although a firewall is meant to give you the ability to protect against threats that are coming out from the outside, a lot of the large-scale types of threats, they must be configured based off of what you're seeing within your organization. So you have to implement the appropriate controls accordingly. And I wish I could give you specific guidance on exactly which controls to implement. This is going to be very varied from organization to organization. And what I mean by that is that, say you're an organization that deploys a lot of web servers, for example. Web servers typically run on port 80, 8080, and 443. So you want to be able to monitor those ports accordingly and block traffic that's coming in and out that may be malicious as needed. So with firewall rules, you can specify using ACL syntax. So for example, pass in quick from this particular IP address to this particular IP address. Pass out quick from this particular IP address to this particular IP address. You can pass in log quick from any port equal to 22. So anything that's equal to 22, you can go ahead and pass in quick accordingly. You can also block in all or block out all as well. Some limitations that are associated with firewalls is that it's defenseless against insiders. So for example, password management issues and and that type of thing, and unregulated traffic. So it protects against attacks originating outside of your network, and traffic inside the organization does not cross the firewall. Compromised computer can steal data from other computers as well. So defenseless against user practices. So flash storage devices, you may see that there are USB flash drives that are just laying around in parking lots. It's defenseless against people that are just plugging in those flash drives into their computers. It's defenseless against encrypted traffic, so it cannot be inspected. So for example, SSL traffic, it can't look at that type of traffic. And the configuration, it's really dependent on the way that you've got it set up. So a poorly configured firewall is going to be very detrimental, because it may even be more detrimental than not having a firewall at all, because you're spending resources into configuring a firewall and you haven't even done it correctly. So it only provides the illusion of security. Now there are multiple types of firewalls that exist. There's packet filtering firewalls. So what packet filtering firewalls will do is that they'll examine the protocol header fields to determine the entry. So the source and destination IP addresses, the destination port address, the TCP flags, and so on. The example of this being used is that it blocks incoming packets from an ISP with a history of sending spam. So there's something actually called what's called IP reputation services, where the idea of an IP reputation service is that each IP has a particular reputation associated with it. You can actually build a packet filtering firewall that will look at particular IPs with a low reputation based on however you define it, and be able to block that accordingly. Deep packet inspection firewalls will examine packet data in addition to protocol headers. They'll compare against a database of known malicious payloads and identify payloads that attempt to launch buffer overflows or other attacks. So it'll actually go beyond the packet header level and look at the particular packets themselves, and look at what the packets are actually containing within them. Some typical deployment involves perimeter firewalls, demilitarized zones, interior firewalls, and militarized zones. So a perimeter firewall lies between the external network and an organization. It allows hosts outside of the organization to get access to public-facing services. And you want this to happen because there's web services, email, DNS, and so on. There's also what's called a demilitarized zone, or a DMZ. It's a network between the external network and the organization's internal network, and it hosts external services such as HTTP, SMT, and DNS. This is another mechanism that you can implement in order to make sure that you are getting into effective cybersecurity practices. There's the interior firewall, so it limits access to the organization's internal network. So what happens is that there's certain applications for requests coming from specific hosts. So for example, a student learning system and records database. You can be able to set up a firewall that will identify the traffic within a network and be able to block them accordingly or allow access to them accordingly. And then the militarized zone as well is that location of all the organization's information assets. So something you may see is that there's the internet, there may be an external or firewall right here. There's a DMZ that has like many of the publicly facing services that you need, but it's still protected by this firewall that's right here against many of the other attacks. Then there's another firewall that's protecting the internal network from attacks. So there's multiple layers that are associated with the internal network. You can think also about this as like defense and depth. There's defense because there's a lot of levels that are associated with it, there's a lot of depth associated with it. So some basic firewall recommendations. I can't give you exact recommendations that every organization should follow, but the basic firewall recommendations is that you want to allow users to access the following services on the internet. So web ports, 80 and 443 to specified hosts running web servers. So any hosts or any servers that are running that are web specific, you can think about them having port 80 and 443 open. With email, you want to have ports 25, 465, 585, 993, and 995 for specific hosts that are running email. Now, the key thing here is that even if you want these particular ports open on these particular devices, you got to make sure that those are the only ports that are available that are open on those devices. Because if you start to open up these ports on, say, a web server, this provides a mechanism for hackers to actually get into those particular resources that don't necessarily need to have those ports open. Now, again, if we think back to the systems administration lecture, what systems administrators will think is that open only what's necessary. Only open the things that you need in order to make sure that people get access to only what they need. Whereas a user, excuse me, will actually think about, hey, I don't know if I'll need it or not, but let's just go ahead and keep it open if we need to. That's the mindset that we're trying to avoid. We want to only give access to what we need. And you can see this with DNS and then remote desktop, SSH, and so on. So the general rules of thumb is that you want to allow secure services and encrypt transactions. So in popular use, it's regularly updated. So for SSH, for Unix connections, or remote desktop for Windows clients. Allow access to safe services on designated hosts, so for example, the email on the web, and block legacy or unmaintained services. And this is really on the systems administrator to identify what are the services that are no longer in use and that need to be updated. When I was a systems administrator, I had to make sure that first that the ports that were open as needed, and then from there making sure that the transactions that were going through were actually secure, and there were, we were taking off unmaintained services and so on. So let's get into intrusion detection and prevention systems. So intrusion detection systems, they monitor IT systems for malicious activity or violations. There are two types. They're network-based and host-based. Network-based will monitor the network traffic and application protocol activity to identify specific connections, suspicious connections, excuse me. And they're usually included in routers and firewalls. Host-based is software applications on individual hosts. So they'll monitor local activity such as file access and system calls for suspicious behavior. Most enterprises will actually employ multiple IDSs, each with its own set of rules. And it can raise alarms about impending attacks, so watching for reconnaissance activities such as host and port scans and so on. This often precedes large-scale attacks. So intrusion detection systems compared to firewalls, intrusion detections will actually monitor particular IT systems and see if there's any malicious activity or violation that's going on that goes against a baseline that's actually been provided by the organization. Now this is very reactive in nature. That baseline is often based off of what are the different types of attacks that organizations have already seen in the past. Intrusion protection or prevention systems build in an IDS and attempt to stop the potential intrusions. So how do the IDS and IPS actually detect intrusions? There's three methods. One is signatures, two is anomalies, and three is protocol states. And most commercial implementations will actually use a combination of all three to maximize the effectiveness. The signatures will actually look at the sequence of bytes that is known to be part of a malicious software. So what it's based off of is that it knows all the different, or at least a large amount of malicious software that exists today. Anomalies are deviations between the observed events and defined activity patterns. So there is a defined set of activities, so a baseline that's been set, and then the anomalies will actually detect the deviations between the observed events and the defined activity events. And the protocol states compares the observed events against defined activities for each protocol state. So signature-based, they're very effective against well-known threats. So if you know that there's a lot of threats that are out there, say there's been threats that have been brewing since 2005, and we've gone ahead and built a repository of them as needed. What signature-based methods will do is that they're very effective against well-known threats. They're also very computationally efficient. They use simple string comparison operations, but they're not effective against previously unknown threats, disguised threats, and complex threats. So the I love you virus with the email subject line of job offer for you. It also can't detect threats composed of multiple events. So if individual events are potentially legitimate, it can't detect each of those individual events. So for example, port scans, or each individual probe packet is a well-formed and legitimate packet. So everything looks legit, but the way that they're being done is very it's very sequential, and detection-based methods signature-based methods can't pick that up. Anomaly-based methods are very effective at detecting previously unknown threats. So it's malware that sends out large volumes of spam email. What the anomaly-based method will do is it'll be like, hey, this large amount of spam email is very different from what we've seen in the past. Or a malware that uses computer to break passwords. The computer's behavior is very different than what it was in the past. But the concern with this is that you have to have some sort of a baseline, and building profiles can be very challenging. So a computer may perform full backups on the last day of the month. So for example, there could be large amounts of network data transfer, and if it's not included as part of the baseline profile, this will be flagged as a malicious event, and an intrusion prevention system will actually go ahead and try to block that event from happening. But that's a totally legit event that's actually occurring. Protocol state-based methods are aware of allowed operations for a given protocol state. So it knows the user in an unauthenticated state should only attempt a limited number of login attempts, or a user in an unauthenticated state should only attempt a small set of commands. It should be able to identify unexpected sequences of commands. So for example, issuing the same command repeatedly can indicate a brute force attack, and it can keep track of the user ID for each session. So it's very useful for forensics purposes, investigating a particular incident. It can include checks for individual commands, so monitoring the lengths of commands, being able to identify a username with a length of 1,000 characters that can be considered suspicious. And these protocols are actually based off of business processes that you've defined. And the username with non-text data is even more unusual and merits flagging. And you can think about the SQL injection part of the homework or the assignment that you did. Those are unverified types of inputs that are being put into a particular form. A protocol state-based method will actually detect these particular types of unsanitized input, and an IPS will actually block that from happening and prevent it in some way, shape, or form. Now, the limitation is that tracking many simultaneous sessions can be very resource intensive. So there are many limitations associated with IDS and IPS. The two well-known limitations is that there's detection errors. Many alarms actually do not represent real threats. These are called false positives. And many real threats are missed. These are called false negatives. And reducing one generally increases the other. So a very sensitive IDS will actually detect more real attacks, but it'll also flag many benign transactions as malicious. So it's actually super sensitive and very, very, very sensitive to any type of traffic that's coming through. A less sensitive IDS will not raise too many false alarms, but also miss real attacks. Generally speaking, you want to have a more sensitive IDS than a less sensitive IDS. And the reason for this is that you're actually going to be blocking more of the real attacks, because real attacks are very expensive. So organizations generally prefer false positives or false negatives, and it increases the cost of sifting through all of the alarms raised. But that's still better than the cost of having an actual cyber attack happening. Evasion is an act of conducting malicious activity so that it looks safe. Conducting port scans extremely slowly over many days, so for example, advanced persistent threats, and malware can be sent as parts of file attachments and look very legitimate. So an IDS or IPS cannot be trusted to detect all malicious activity. But unlike firewalls, they're very effective as part of overall security deployment. And when you take all of these into account together, then you start to build a very robust security posture. Patching operating systems and applications. So a patch is software that corrects security and functionality problems in software and firmware. It's also called updates. So just as a recap, passwords and access control lists, they look at the people level within an organization. They identify what level of what they need to know is there, so the complexity, as well as what they get access to. Firewalls and intrusion detection and prevention systems are focused on the network level, and patching operating systems and application looks at the particular devices on a particular network and being able to update them accordingly. And all of these are very important tasks for a systems administrator to execute, and you've already executed some of this in past assignments, and also you'll be doing this more in future assignments. So a patch is a software that corrects security and functionality problems in software and firmware. It's also called updates. It's usually the most effective way to mitigate software vulnerabilities. So patch management is the process of identifying, acquiring, installing, and verifying patches. And many information security frameworks will impose patch management requirements. So we've talked a lot about, say, the payment card industry, PCI, or the DSS. the data security standard that's all associated with the PCI, that requires critical patches must be installed within 1 month of the release of the patch. So PCI DSS 2.0 requirement 6.1.b. And the concern is that patches can break existing software. So even though patches are very powerful for making sure that there are, all of the vulnerable code has actually been addressed with accordingly, there are still concerns associated with patches. So for example, with SCADA systems, if you patch them, that actually may take them offline. And this is also a concern when you're dealing with in-house software that's developed using older technologies. Those older technologies, there may be people that don't have that type of skill set anymore, but they are, they're still very, very important pieces of technology within your organization. So if you patch them, you may actually break a lot of the code that's in there. So NIST has actually specified, the timing, prioritization, and testing of patches. So it's usually necessary to prioritize which patches should be installed first. Typically, there'll be a lot of patches that are going to be installed within your organization, because if you think about all the technologies that could be deployed within an organization, the varying nature of them, there could be varying types of patches that are associated with them accordingly. So it's usually necessary to prioritize which patches should be installed first, because there is a cost associated with patching. So web servers may need to be prioritized over desktops in a militarized zone. And you want to identify what are the critical assets within your organization. We talked about some of the mechanisms in which you could do that in the asset management lecture. The operational system might fail from patching, causing business disruption. So timing, prioritization, and testing are often in conflict. You want to patch bundle solution to conflict. So release aggregates of many patches as patch bundles as quarterly or other periodic schedules. So issue patches instantly for exploits known to be getting exploited. So if you are a hospital and you know that there's a large amount of ransomware that's coming into your organizations or other hospitals as well, you want to make sure that you patch your systems accordingly so that it's more robust against those types of ransomware. It reduces patch testing efforts at organizations and facilitates deployment. With regards to configuration, there are often multiple mechanisms for applying patches. Automatic updates, for example, manual updates, vulnerability scanners, and so on. Completing patch installation procedures can cause conflicts. So may try to overwrite patches, may try to remove previously installed patches, may try to install patches that failed the organization's tests, and so on. So you want to make sure that there are ways that you can identify all ways the patches can be applied and resolve any conflicts among the competing patch or application methods. So you want to configure it accordingly. So users, particularly power users, may override or circumvent patch management processes. So I'll give you some examples. Is that when I was at the artificial intelligence lab, I was actually crawling hacker community data. What I was doing, and this is probably not the greatest practice, is that I was actually going ahead and I was disabling a lot of the patch management software within certain VMs, so that the crawling of those particular sites could actually be crawled in an ongoing way, and the system wouldn't patch, and then I'd have to recrawl everything, and so on and so forth. So patch management is actually super critical, and making sure that you are uninstalling old and unsupported versions of software and uninstalling patches as necessary as well are all critically needed tasks that must be identified by the systems administrator. Additionally, there are alternative hosts, so there's diversity within a computing environment. It may include unsupported hardware. So appliances are a particularly interesting case. Oftentimes, manufacturers are not familiar with the importance of patch management. They just want to get that particular system out into the real world, and may not support automated procedures for testing and deploying patches. So patch management can easily become time-consuming and labor-intensive. So there are a lot of vendors out there that won't necessarily think of security throughout the process. Rather, they'll think about security at the end, if at all. The software inventory is that an organization should maintain current and complete inventory of all patchable software installed on each host in the organization. The inventory should also include a correct version and patch status. Reducing resource overload, so patch deployment needs to be managed in order to prevent overload. So the download speeds can be significantly slow. Some of these patches could be huge. So if you think about, say, the updates for your iPhone, right? Some of those patches could actually be gigabytes in nature. And the network bandwidth can also be a constraint. So some of the common strategies that you can think of is sizing patch infrastructure to handle expected request volumes and staggering delivery of patches. Only deliver patches to a limited number of hosts at any given time. And then you also want to verify the implementation, forcing the required changes on the target host so that the patch takes effect. So it may require restarting a patch application or service. You all have seen this on your machines, restarting that particular machine and being able to actually install that patch accordingly and so on. But this can be very difficult to determine if a particular patch has taken effect on a particular host. And one mechanism is use other methods of confirming installation. So using a vulnerability scanner to make sure that that patch has actually been covered accordingly. Endpoint protection. Endpoint protection is the idea of implementing security at the end user device. So desktops, laptops, and mobile devices directly used by consumers of the IT system. It's typically implemented using specialized software applications. So it provides services such as antivirus protection, anti-malware protection, intrusion detection, and so on. So this is a defense of last resort. So if we think about this right here, there's the password management access control. These are organizational level controls that you can think of. Firewalls and intrusion detection prevention systems are more network based, and then patching operating systems and endpoint protection are more based off of the particular systems themselves. So with the patching operating systems, you're actually covering up some of the holes or vulnerabilities within that particular IT system. Endpoint protection will focus more on the protecting that particular endpoint or that particular system that is an endpoint on your network. It can offer security that organization-wide systems cannot provide. So it's very specific to that particular system. So it also provides protection against other compromised devices internal to the network. So a compromised desktop within the network may scan ports as a zombie. And endpoint software, security software on targeted hosts can detect these scans and block the requests accordingly. And the detection mechanisms that endpoint security or endpoint protection can use are, say, signatures and reputation. Signatures, very similar to the signature-based IPS or IDS. It is a character or a sequence of characters that will actually allow you to see whether or not what you're detecting matches up with a known database of known signatures. And reputation is the safety of a file on reputation score calculated by a file's observable attributes. So you can think about that basically is the reputation of a particular system or particular file that is associated with with what's being generated. And this is very computationally efficient for detecting previously unknown threats. So if you know that a file has a particular particular reputation associated with it, or an IP has a reputation associated with it, that endpoint can block it accordingly. So in this particular lecture, we talked about multiple types of controls. We talked about passwords and firewalls, IDS, IPS, the access control list, patches, endpoint protections, and so on. And those are all different types of controls that you can consider implementing at your organization. It's very important to think about the business processes that are within your organization such that you can deploy the appropriate controls and be able to use them accordingly. And oftentimes you're going to be deploying multiple controls with each other so you can create defense in depth and be able to create a good, strong cybersecurity posture for your organization. As always, feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions. Thanks.